What human beings can be, wrote the psychologist Abraham Maslow, they must be. In the early 20th century, psychologists were primarily concerned with the sicknesses that afflict the human mind. Abraham Maslow, aware of this one-sided approach, saw it as grossly inadequate. If the goal of psychology is not just to rid us of illnesses, but also to help us flourish, then an understanding of what constitutes optimal psychological health is crucial. It is as if Freud supplied us the sick half of psychology, wrote Maslow, and now we must fill it out with the healthy half. Maslow's research led him to the conclusion that what demarcates the psychologically flourishing from the sick and mediocre is the ability to self-actualize. In this video, we'll explore what it means to self-actualize and examine why most people struggle at this all-important task. According to Maslow, humans are driven to satisfy what he called a hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization occupies the pinnacle of this hierarchy, and therefore we cannot begin to self-actualize until we have satisfied our more basic needs. These basic needs include the things necessary for our survival, such as food, water, and shelter, as well as those things required for a basic modicum of psychological health, such as safety, love, status, belongingness, and self-esteem. Only after these basic needs are satisfied can we begin down the path of self-actualization and strive, in the words of Maslow, to become everything one is capable of becoming. Musicians must make music, wrote Maslow. Artists must paint. Poets must write if they are to be ultimately at peace with themselves. What human beings can be, they must be. They must be true to their own nature. This need we may call self-actualization. It refers to man's desire for self-fulfillment, namely to the tendency for him to become actually in what he is potentially. When we begin the process of self-actualization, mastery of self becomes our way of life. We view our psyche as a vast unexplored terrain and are motivated to gain a greater knowledge of its inner depths. Rather than being driven solely by wealth or status, we choose an ambitious and meaningful life mission. As we strive to achieve our goals, we devote our energies to mastering the necessary skills, and in the process, we actualize our latent potentials. As our life becomes increasingly structured around the need to self-actualize, Maslow discovered that we become more susceptible to peak experiences. Self-actualizing people, wrote Maslow, have the wonderful capacity to appreciate again and again, freshly and naively, the basic goods of life, with awe, pleasure, wonder, and even ecstasy, however stale these experiences may have become to others. Peak experiences have a deep therapeutic effect and can permanently transform our self-image and view of the world. While they cannot be voluntarily stimulated, Maslow discovered that they arise spontaneously in self-actualizers far more frequently than in the majority of the population, implying that they are a byproduct of the personal growth that self-actualizers experience as they cultivate their skills and strive to realize their potential. Another trait shared by self-actualizers is their tendency to be free from the constricting need for social acceptance and the obsession many people have with social comparison. Rather than looking to others for approval or to social standards or authorities to determine how to live, such individuals defer matters of judgment to their own conscience. The French philosopher Montaigne, who exhibited this characteristic, captured it in the following line from his essays: "I have my own laws and my own court to judge me, and I refer to these rather than elsewhere." Or as Maslow explains, self-actualizers have become strong enough to be independent of the good opinion of other people, or even their affection. The honors, the status, the rewards, the popularity, the prestige, and the love they can bestow must have become less important than self-development and inner growth. With this basic understanding of self-actualization, we are left with an important question. If all of us can, in principle, self-actualize, why do so few of us end up doing so? Why, in other words, do most of us become more complacent, conformist, bitter, and neurotic as we age, rather than more individualized, joyous, creative, and productive? Maslow spent much time deliberating this question, and to answer it he suggested that there exist regressive forces in the psyche which inhibit growth. We must understand, he wrote, that the dark forces are as normal as the growth forces. While most of us will claim that actualizing our potentials is something we desire to do, in reality we are often far more attracted by the easy path of safety and comfort. We avoid challenges which would lead to personal growth, refuse to face up to our fears, and remain passive in a manner which inhibits our capacity to self-actualize. The pull of these regressive forces places us in a dangerous position, for if we allow ourselves to succumb to them, then over time we will pay a steep price. Anxiety, guilt, shame, and self-hate will manifest and torture us internally. But the presence of these symptoms does not necessarily mean that all is lost. Rather, as Maslow suggests, if we can learn to view these symptoms not as a sign that we are ill and in need of medication, but rather as a cry from the growth forces within, warning us that a change in our life is needed, we will have taken the first step toward becoming a self-actualizer, and thus one of those rare individuals who succeed in being human. He who belies his talent, wrote Maslow, the born painter who sells stockings instead, the intelligent man who lives a stupid life, the man who sees the truth and keeps his mouth shut, the coward who gives up his manliness. All these people perceive in a deep way that they have done wrong to themselves and despise themselves for it. Out of this self-punishment may come only neurosis, but there may equally come renewed courage, righteous indignation, increased self-respect, because of thereafter doing the right thing. In a word, growth and improvement can come through pain and conflict. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. This passage was written by Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and a pioneering mind behind advertising, modern propaganda, and the field of public relations. Bernays' influence was enormous. Relying heavily on the insights of his uncle, he developed highly successful manipulation techniques which are still used today, not only by companies to sell consumer products, but also by the powers that be to, in the words of Bernays, control and regiment the masses. In this video, we'll explore some of Bernays' most intriguing ideas, paying particular attention to his insights on how group psychology can be used to control and manipulate the masses. In his classic work, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Sigmund Freud described group psychology as being concerned with the individual man as a member of a race, of a nation, of a caste, of a profession, of an institution, or as a component part of a crowd of people who have been organized into a group at some particular time for some definite purpose. In other words, group psychology attempts to understand how an individual's behavior, thoughts, and emotions change when becoming a part of a group. The tendency of human beings to form groups was selected for in our evolutionary past due to the survival benefits it offered. Ancient humans who organized into tribes were more likely to survive and reproduce in the harsh environments in which they lived. However, with the help of modern technologies, humans today have transformed the environment in a manner which renders the survival value of tribal organization obsolete. But with that said, the ancient and instinctual pull of tribal organization still looms large in the lives of most, with many people today identifying and hence stereotyping both themselves and others based on things such as race, class, gender, nationality, religion, or the political party or ideology to which one adheres. This continued proclivity to engage in group identification is, according to Bernays, a function of the enlarged sense of self-importance that individuals derive from identifying with a potentially powerful mass. Just as the wolf pack is many times as strong as the combined strength of its individual members, so too the individual senses the potential power of the group, and it derives feelings of potency in identifying with it. Beginning in the late 19th century, a number of thinkers, most notably Freud and Gustave Le Bon, attempted to understand why people engage in group identification and how group identification affects one's mind and behavior. As Bernays noted, the insights that emerged from this study caught the attention of those in positions of power who wanted to expand their control of societies. These people saw the potential of taking the theoretical insights of group psychology and transforming them into practical methods that could be used to manipulate the masses from outside of the public's eye, a task which formed the basis of Bernays' work in public relations. As Bernays explained in his book, Propaganda, the systematic study of mass psychology revealed the potentialities of invisible government of society by manipulation of the motives which actuate man in the group. These studies established that the group has mental characteristics distinct from those of the individual, and is motivated by impulses and emotions which cannot be explained on the basis of what we know of individual psychology. So the question naturally arose: if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it? The great potential of using insights from group psychology to control the masses is partly a function of the fact that an individual can be influenced by a group or crowd even when physically isolated. As Bernays pointed out in his book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, a crowd does not mean merely a physical aggregation of a number of persons. The crowd is rather a state of mind. So long as one engages in group identification, their mind and behavior will be changed by the enduring influence of group psychology, even with no other members of the group physically present. To understand how the tendency of human beings to engage in group identification renders the masses manipulable, we must turn to one of Freud's ideas which heavily influenced the manipulation techniques developed by Bernays. In his book Propaganda, published in 1928, Bernays explained, "It is chiefly the psychologists of the school of Freud who have pointed out that many of man's thoughts and actions are compensatory substitutes for desires which he has been obliged to suppress. A thing may be desired not for its intrinsic worth or usefulness, but because he has unconsciously come to see in it a symbol of something else, the desire for which he is ashamed to admit to himself. A man buying a car may think he wants it for purposes of locomotion. He may really want it because it is a symbol of social position, an evidence of his success in business, or a means of pleasing his wife. What Freud suggested is that often there is a divorce between one's conscious thoughts and feelings and desires which do not fit with one's self-image and which are therefore suppressed. This fact, Bernays recognized, renders human beings manipulable. For what it implies is that if one can design propaganda or psychological operations that bypass the conscious and rational faculties of the individual, targeting instead suppressed emotions and hidden desires, it is possible to move people to adopt beliefs and behaviors without them being aware of the underlying motivations leading them on. As Bernays explained, men are very largely actuated by motives which they conceal from themselves. It is evident that the successful propagandist must understand the true motives, and not be content to accept the reasons which men give for what they do. It is possible, although often difficult, for an individual to become aware of the underlying motives driving their beliefs and actions through honest and critical introspection. However, once one succumbs to the effects of group identification, such critical introspection becomes nearly impossible. A group is extraordinarily credulous and open to influence, wrote Freud. It has no critical faculty. In identifying with a group, the individual subordinates self-analysis and a discerning search for the truth in favor of maintaining group interests and cohesion. And with their critical capacities weakened by the influence of group psychology, they become highly susceptible to psychological operations designed to target suppressed or unconscious desires and emotions. In the modern day, there appears to be forces operating through the mainstream media and popular culture which are attempting to increase the individual's proclivity to engage in certain types of group identification, namely, identifications that divide the population into conflicting groups. This phenomenon has potentially dire consequences for both the stability and freedom of a society, as it allows those in power to institute the age-old tactic of divide and conquer. In his book, Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli noted that those who have held power over a population have long realized that a population united is always stronger than those who rule over it, and thus stretching back into ancient times, rulers have sought to divide the many and weaken the force which was strong while it was united through the use of those methods which promote division. By dividing a population along lines such as race, class, religion, gender, or political preference, or in other words, into groups naturally prone to clash, the effects of group psychology render rational discourse and debate between individuals in these separate groups extremely unlikely. Each group, Bernays wrote, considers its own standards ultimate and indisputable, and tends to dismiss all contrary or different standards as indefensible. Unable to settle differences in opinions via rational discourse, groups whose belief structures clash tend to revert to more destructive means in their attempt to defeat those they perceive as a threat. A society dominated by such groups is thus easily divided in increasingly hostile conflict, and as a result, not only does the population as a whole become weakened, as Machiavelli pointed out, but its eyes are diverted away from the actions of those operating behind the scenes, who constitute, in the words of Bernays, the invisible government who controls the destinies of millions. While there is nothing wrong with deriving a sense of belonging based on the commonalities we share with others, it is misguided to base our personal identity primarily on our group memberships. In terms of our evolutionary history, it is only fairly recently that we developed the ability to become aware of ourselves as individuals, separate from any group or tribe. This was a crucial development in consciousness, as the existence of a society based on individual rights and personal liberties is dependent on a population which has developed this capacity for individual consciousness, or in other words, on a society of individuals who understand themselves and treat others as individuals first and foremost. As Erich Neumann pointed out in his classic work, The Origins and History of Consciousness, prior to the development of this capacity for individual consciousness, the group and group consciousness were dominant. The individual was not an autonomous, individualized entity with a knowledge, morality, volition, and activity of its own. It functioned solely as a part of the group, and the group, with its superordinate power, was the only real subject. Seen in this light, the proclivity of individuals today to engage in group identification is not only a danger to the freedom and stability of a society, but it is also a regression of consciousness back to a more primitive psychological state, and therefore, from the standpoint of modernity, a pathological tendency that needs to be overcome. Or as Sigmund Freud put it, each individual has a share in numerous group minds, those of his race, of his class, of his creed, of his nationality, etc. And he can also raise himself above them, to the extent of having a scrap of independence and originality. There is only one inborn error, and that is the notion that we exist in order to be happy. So long as we persist in this inborn error, and indeed even become confirmed in it through optimistic dogmas, the world seems to us full of contradictions. The modern world is obsessed with the notion of happiness. It is seen as both the measure and the goal of the good life, and as Sigmund Freud noted, much of what we do is motivated by the all-consuming desire to be happy. What the behavior of men themselves reveals as the purpose and object of their lives, what they demand of life and wish to attain in it, the answer to this can hardly be in doubt. They seek happiness. They want to become happy and remain so. But is this endless search for happiness really a healthy way to live? For if we are unhappy, which for most people is most of the time, we will probably wonder what is wrong with us. Are we not cut out for this world? Are the chemicals in our brain in need of a pharmaceutical adjustment? Or rather, was Schopenhauer correct in suggesting that aiming at happiness is a futile endeavor? Might we account our lives more fulfilling if rather than striving for happiness, we devoted our energies to cultivating a meaningful life? In this video, we will explore these questions. Happiness has not always been considered a target worth striving for. The root of the word happiness in most Indo-European languages is luck or fate, implying that happiness was originally viewed as something to be given and taken away by the gods or by chance. It was not thought to be attainable through human effort alone. In the West, it was Socrates who popularized the idea that happiness is the greatest good and should therefore be the ultimate aim of life. What being is there that does not desire happiness? Well then, since all of us desire happiness, how can we be happy? That is the next question. Socrates' assumption that we should aim for happiness was widely accepted by the ancient Greek philosophers who came after him. The Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries, whose ideas laid the foundation for modern civilization, also adopted Socrates' view of happiness as the ultimate end. But while the ancient Greeks tended to ground happiness in the cultivation of virtue and personal excellence, some of the most prominent thinkers of the Enlightenment tied the pursuit of happiness to the pursuit of pleasure. Happiness, then, wrote John Locke, is in its full extent the utmost pleasure we are capable of, and misery the utmost pain. The maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain is the recipe that many in our day use in the attempt to attain happiness. But structuring our life in this manner places us on a hedonic treadmill. We spend our lives frantically running towards the goods, goals, events, and people whom we hope will imbue our life with the pleasure needed for a happy existence. Yet upon attaining the objects of our desire, we quickly acclimate to our new conditions and return to our default state of being. Or as the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer observed, striving for happiness is like an unquenchable thirst. We may attain some brief satisfactions, some momentary release, but in the nature of things these can never be more than temporary, and then we are on the rack once more. So unhappiness, or at least dissatisfaction, is our normal state of affairs. In our more introspective moments, many of us recognize the constant pursuit of happiness as a grasping for shadows. But what is the alternative? If we abandon the pursuit of happiness, what should take its place? In the remainder of this video, we will make the case that we should pursue a meaningful life. For as Carl Jung observed, the lack of meaning in life is a soul sickness, whose full extent and import our age has not yet begun to comprehend. One of the main reasons in favor of the cultivation of meaning as our primary aim is due to the inevitability of suffering. While most of our suffering is minor and manageable, we tend to ignore the fact that we are forever at risk of descending into periods of great adversity, times in which we are forced to contend with what Shakespeare called the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. In these moments of crisis, it is meaning alone, not happiness, which can provide us with the resilience needed to endure. He who has a why can bear almost any how, wrote Nietzsche, or as Carl Jung put it, meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. Meaning, in other words, is the raw material out of which we can build our inner citadel, or psychological fortress, from which we can navigate the chaotic currents of life. But how do we cultivate meaning in our life? While no guaranteed prescription exists, some approaches seem to be far more tenable than others. One approach that does not fall into the category of tenability is the attempt to find meaning through the attainment of external goods, such as money, fame, status, or relationships. These goods can augment the quality of our life, but it is unlikely they will imbue it with meaning. Many people develop a successful career, raise a family, amass wealth and social status, only to discover, often around midlife, that despite their outward success, their inward existence remains desolate and devoid of meaning. Or as Jung wrote, a career, producing of children are all Maya compared to that one thing, that your life is meaningful. A far more practical approach to the pursuit of meaning is to focus on the cultivation of our character. What does your conscience say, wrote Nietzsche? You shall become the person you are. Or as the pre-Socratic Heraclitus put it, character is fate. If we focus on becoming a more complete and integrated individual, we greatly increase our chance of finding meaning for two main reasons. Firstly, this approach is an antidote to the stagnation and passivity which guarantees a meaningless existence. And secondly, by striving to cultivate our strengths, we will likely discover the why or purpose to our existence, which is key to a subjectively meaningful life. To assist us on this path, we need to discuss the role that goals play in this process. The importance of setting goals for the sake of personal development is well known. For just as the stone can be shaped into a sculpture only through the force of a hammer and chisel, so too our potential, or the development of our character, can only be actualized through discipline, struggle, and exertion. To merely float with the tide of life promotes a weak body and a soft mind. Hence, we need to learn to swim with the stream of life and strive and fight for worthy goals. Foolish are those, wrote Marcus Aurelius, who have no aim to which they can direct every impulse and indeed every thought. While most are aware of the importance of goal setting, many make the mistake of sacrificing themselves for their goals. They believe it is the attainment of goals which builds character and cultivates meaning, when in fact it is the continual struggle towards them which matters most. This theme of the importance of incessant striving is foundational in Goethe's classic tale of Faust. For Goethe has Faust achieved self-realization only through his commitment to perpetual struggle and strife. Whoever exerts himself in constant striving, him we can redeem. In continuously striving for goals, it is crucial to keep in mind that our goals are only of value if they contribute to the growth of our character. Sometimes our goals no longer move us forward, as they may have only been appropriate for a stage of our development we have outgrown. At the age of 20, the writer Hunter Thompson elaborated this advice in a letter to a friend. When you were young, let us say that you wanted to be a fireman. I feel reasonably safe in saying that you no longer want to be a fireman. Why? Because your perspective has changed. It's not the fireman who has changed, but you. Every man is the sum total of his reactions to experience. As your experiences differ and multiply, you become a different man, and hence your perspective changes. So we do not strive to be firemen, we do not strive to be bankers, nor policemen, nor doctors. We strive to be ourselves. The goal is absolutely secondary. It is the functioning toward the goal which is important. In following this advice, in relentlessly striving towards goals, while continually modifying them to facilitate the continued development of our character, we will place ourselves on a potentially meaningful life path. Choosing this path requires that we abandon our obsession with happiness and pleasure. But ironically, in stepping off the hedonic treadmill and exposing ourselves to the struggles and strife required to cultivate character, we will likely attain the transient state of happiness far more frequently than those who aim squarely for it. For as Hunter Thompson wrote, "Who is the happier man? He who has braved the storm of life and lived, or he who has stayed securely on the shore and merely existed?"